Welcome to episode 1 of QUILTSIDE Chats. Brought to you by the American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. Sponsored by Quilt Folk, a quarterly keepsake magazine of, by, and for quilters. QUILTSIDE Chats are a series of lively conversations between Carolyn Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an AQSG member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Carolyn Ducey is Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum, a position she has held since 1998. She oversees acquisition and management of the IQM collection of more than 8,500 quilts. Ducey earned an MA in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998 and her PhD in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in quilt studies at the University of Nebraska in 2010. She is co-editor of American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, published in 2018, and a co-author of What's in a Name? Inscribed Quilts, published in 2012. We're thrilled to have Marianne Fons as our very first guest in our QUILTSIDE Chat series. Marianne Fons is well known to quilters nationwide as a longtime public television host of Fons and Porter's Love of Quilting and as an author and lecturer. She has served on the advisory board of the International Quilt Museum, the board of directors of Quilts of Valor Foundation, and is a founding member of the Iowa Quilt Museum. With Liz Porter, she was the 2019 inductee into the Quilters Hall of Fame. Visit her at mariannefons.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's Carolyn, and I'm so excited to be here with Marianne. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Carolyn. I wish we were really together, but one day soon.
So soon. I just know it. You know, we're sisters here in the Midwest, the Iowa Quilt Museum and the International Quilt Museum. So we have plans. We have to get together soon. So
yeah, you know, I wrote a little blog post about this event, posted it pretty recently, but I checked the time. You know, you can drive from the Iowa Quilt Museum to the International Quilt Museum in about 2.5 hours. So, you know, you can hit them both in a short period of time.
Yeah. And hopefully everybody will be out and about soon.
Yes.
So Marianne, as our first guest on QUILTSIDE Chats, tell me, which quilt do you want to sneak out of the building if it's not a crime?
Well, people have seen a glimpse of the quilt I selected on the publicity. And, you know, in thinking about this, you know, I have seen thousands and thousands of quilts. And, you know, from the most, you know, labor-intensive Baltimore album or whole cloth quilt with tiny stitches. And, you know, I love symmetry and I love design. And yet, you know, the quilt that I picked that kind of started this whole thing off is a very humble quilt whose workmanship, the workmanship of which would not win a prize. So our tech guru who's behind the scenes, Tara Miller, thank you for everything, Tara, is going to put the flat shot up on the screen so everybody can kind of feast their eyes on this unusual quilt.
It's so unusual. And I was, you know, I guess if I were to pick for you, this is not one I would have picked, Marianne, but what made you fall in love with this piece?
Well, you know, I was looking through the collection years ago when I was working on a lecture a PowerPoint lecture called Why We Quilt. And it was an examination of the motivations of American quilters, from 1776 to modern times. And, I think one of this quilt grabbed me because, you can kind of read it like a book. And the quilt maker was obviously motivated to put her family record in fabric. Just writing down everybody's name and birth dates in the Bible wasn't going to do for her. And so I do hear my dog barking. I knew it was going to happen. To orient people to this quilt a little bit, it reads from the top left down that first column, and then the second column, third column, fourth column. And so if we zoom in, well, the first block says Papa born, and it gives the date of Papa's birth. And, we know who made this quilt. We're going to talk about Susa, Missouri Hale Harris. But, she refers to herself in third person in the second block, Mama born. And someone did throw out the idea that maybe a daughter made it, that someone else might have made it. But everything that we have about this quilt, I think you'd agree, Carolyn, it suggests that Susa Harris was the maker.
Yes, and the really wonderful thing about this quilt is that we were able to talk to descendants. So was it her grandchildren or great-grandchildren? And they also felt like she was probably the maker, and that's why we do list her as the maker of the quilt. Yeah. And I don't think it's really uncommon for people to refer to themselves that way, especially as a parent, your mom, your mama. So, but it is definitely something that we always want to bear in mind, is those kind of questions. Do we really know what we know?
Because she didn't sign it exactly. But the people's, only the first names are on this quilt. And really when I saw it, this quilt grabbed me and has never let me go. And for one, I'm a lit major, I love literature, and I thought these names, they're like from a William Faulkner novel. And Xenia Cord helped me find census records online, and I was able to find the dates in the family and corroborate all the information. So I'm gonna let you talk for a second while I go deal with my dog. I'll be right back.
Gravel once in on our discussion today. Well, this quilt was made in Texas, and it is, as Marianne said, it's such a humble quilt. You'll notice in kind of the lower left quadrant, you can still see shadows of what would have been an inked design on a feed sack cloth. So you can see there on Lehman's block, right behind him, are those shadows that would have been left from when you got your feed sacks. The idea was that you could wash all of that ink out and reuse them. And so this quilt really doesn't have anything that is particularly fancy about it, but it still is so special. And it's so, I don't know why I always think of this quilt as such a heartfelt quilt. It always touches me in such a deep way. And I don't know if it's because it's got both birth and death dates on it, or if it's just because it's such a humble quilt and there is her life kind of all wrapped up for us. I don't know. Why do you think it gives you that?
What I concluded, and we can I'll kind of go through some of the math of some of these names and people, is that, when my question was, who are these people? Well, they're the people that were important to Susa Harris at the time she made the quilt. And so we look at the top block, and then we get to, I think that we have the detail of Mama's block. And then the third block down is their marriage. And so I've got a lot of little notes for myself on this, but the third block down. Okay, so what we have here is that Mama is age 20 and Papa is 43 when they marry. So that in itself is kind of fascinating. So, we can say every quilt tells a story, but here goes their story. And so the fourth block down, Lehman, is born 9 months and 3 days after their marriage, according to the quilt. The bottom block on the left side, Riller, is a girl, Riller Cassandra. And so she's born not much later. And so over the life of this quilt, you have 8 kids born over a 22-year period. So Sousa was pregnant from age 20 to age 44, which, you know,
That's
not uncommon.
No, not uncommon. You know, I'm one of 8 children myself, Marianne, and yeah, I mean, it was exact the same situation with my mom, and I think that was just really very typical. But my gosh, I am always in awe of my mom and these women who led such full lives, but still always were creative, because I know my mom always sat with something in her hands. When she sat down, she was always creating.
Right. Did we look at the picture of Sousa by herself already when I was there? We don't know just what age she was there, but she looks pretty young. You know, you mentioned the grandchildren, and when I got interested in this quilt, I started hunting around, and I can't remember how it happened, but you know, next thing I knew, I got an email from Tommy Harris, Sousa's grandson, who was working on a oil pipeline job in Madagascar, and he wrote to me, and he and I corresponded quite a while, and I learned a lot about Sousa Harris. And Tommy and his cousin would spend summers with their grandmother in Texas, kind of in the, is it Greene County? It's kind of a
Hunt County.
Hunt County, yeah. And he told me this story that you know, she chewed tobacco, and when they were boys, you know, they asked her if they could have tobacco to chew, and she wouldn't give it to him. And so first she gave him cocoa and sugar to chew and spit, you know, and they learned to spit that. And then they told her that it was kind of losing interest. And so she gave him coffee grounds to chew. And he chewed coffee. And he said, you know, I still chew coffee sometimes when I need to stay up all night. So she was a large woman. She was real tall. And if we look at the picture of her with her sisters that Tara had up a minute ago, you know, they were all large women. I think she's the third from the left, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great photo.
Yeah. And I suppose we could date it by those cars, although I imagine those cars were not brand new when the picture was taken.
Yeah, I'm sure they weren't.
Yeah. So if we look at the overall quilt too, another thing about it that just kind of blows my mind is that, you know, okay, she made the bottom right block, you know, his papa died in 1925. But, you know, as a writer, you know, you're always editing. And so this quilt got edited or added to, because there on the second row below Carol's block, we have LB, which is a grandchild, I believe. And then in the third row, we've got another addition. And here it's very Faulkner-esque again. Wayne Sue, who's a boy, was born in 1928. So these are not not all the names are children, because the children actually stop with Preston, born in 1920. And Preston was the youngest, and he was killed in action in 1944. And one of the stories that there's Preston. And so one of the stories that Tommy talked about, there also was a Susan Macy, one of your volunteers, did a lot of research too, and that Sousa was quite, you know, she was age 49 when I think, let's see, when I forget now how old she would have been 44 when he was born. But anyway, she was kind of obsessed with finding his remains, that he was killed, and then his remains were found and were brought back and given a burial, but it was after her death.
Yeah, not till 2005 when they were unexpectedly discovered. Yeah, Tommy mentioned that Sousa kept the quilt in a trunk at the foot of her bed, and the only time they saw her open that trunk was when she was looking at her papers, all the letters she wrote and all the information she had about Preston, and you know, trying to find him and writing to the government and asking for help. And so, you know, from that we kind of gathered, you know, this was a really significant quilt for her because she kept it with something that was so dear to her. And it was just amazing, but also very sad that she was gone by the time his body was recovered and brought back home.
Yeah, true. Well, and you know, interestingly about that box is when I was going down the rabbit hole on this quilt, I tracked down Laura Fisher in New York City, who had purchased the quilt from an antique dealer and picker named John Sauls, who some people may know. And so when I heard about this big old box that she kept her quilts in, I asked John Sauls about it, and he said, yeah, very frequently these country families had some kind of pine box, and they would keep their bed linens in it in the summertime. And he even had collected some of those. So it was very common in that part of the country.
Yeah. Don't imagine she had a lot of special things like that. Do you? She seemed like they probably lived a pretty tough life.
Well, yeah, he said they were dirt poor farmers, and actually the ground where they farmed, I think, is flooded over now. That was a reservoir. This is a picture of Tom, who is Papa, there on the left, and Lehman, the oldest boy, on the right. And we don't know much about Papa, but Tommy did say that the word they used was that he was a hard man.
Yeah.
With this young wife.
Yeah. He was twice her age, and that must have been difficult too. But you know, I think, you know, when you're raising a family like that and you're struggling to survive, you get very focused, and you know, I don't know, my grandfather was that way. He wasn't very much of a talker, just trying to do his thing and take care of his family. So Marianne, we had a question about feed sacks and when feed sacks first appeared. Feed sacks are something we see regularly in quilts, especially of the 20s and 30s. We see printed feed sacks in the 20s and 30s. So, and these ordinary feed sacks, I think the first ones that we have a substantial collection because Gloria Hall, a great Nebraska researcher, collected and gave her feed sack collection to us. And I think they started in the 1850s using feed sacks and sugar sacks and flour sacks. So anything that any material you could put in a sack was a great way to transport it. And then we see a lot of these feed sacks typically on the back of quilts all through that second half of the 1900s. And then, as I said, the printed sacks really come in the 20s and 30s when it was a way to sell your feed, a particular brand, because you would go looking for a particular design or color combination that you wanted for your dress or your toaster cover or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, super. One of the most clever marketing plans ever. And I was looking through my papers here, the Riller block, which is the bottom left one. You can see the feed sack. I mean, I think Sousa used feed sacks as her background fabric. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this certainly indicates the level of poverty that this family experienced. Can you see? I think people can see that
shadow.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny. This is our first event like this, and so as I knew the dog would bark, and now you know it's springtime here, so there's a fly buzzing around, and now I heard for some reason the smoke alarm in the kitchen is chirping, so the battery has so I got up and closed the door. So sorry about all that, but. You know, one of the things that I talk, the butt is flying right past the camera. You know, speaking of feed sacks and that whole tradition, Carolyn, of people using them for making household linens and clothing and so forth. And I can't think where I ever heard this, but, you know, those of us that love quilts and we look at the quilts of the 1930s and they're so beautiful and you know, we have sort of this nostalgia about them, but a lot of times the people that wore these feed sack clothing, it reminded them of hard times. You know, it didn't remind them of anything they wanted to remember. As a matter of fact, you know, Tommy told me that his uncle Troy, who I think is one that never married, you know, burned up a lot of the stuff that they had. Oh, here Julie's telling us about feed sacks.
Yeah, and by the way, no printed feed sacks before 1937. I'm corrected. I appreciate that information.
That's great. We got a great group here. It's like a brain trust.
Yes, it is.
But you know, people didn't have fond memories of a lot of these things. And you know, if you had to wear your underwear made out of scratchy feed sacks, you know, you didn't really think that was so great. And you know, Troy Harris sold the quilt to John Saul's. And then John Saul's brought it to a quilt search day in Texas. And so, you know, I think we think, well, I mean, this quilt's in a museum and it's such a fascinating, unique quilt, but, you know, the people just kind of wanted rid of things. And, you know, if you kind of think of the psychology of the time, it's understandable that someone might part. Yeah, someone's talking about the letter N. If any of you out there have ever done applique lettering as I have, it's very easy to understand how something might get reversed, especially if you're using a solid fabric, because, you know, if it's a print, you can kind of keep it under control. And so she kind of has her own font in this.
Yeah, and Marianne, do we know anything about Sousa's education? I doubt that she had much of an extended education, just because the time she was living and growing up. There are a lot of young women who didn't attend school after probably a few years at elementary age.
Yeah, right. I mean, you'd think maybe, and we don't know, but, you know, you think maybe she might have had an 8th grade education. I mean, my own aunt, Catherine, who, well, I can't think just what dates, but I mean, in here in Madison County, I mean, you went to country school up to 8th grade. And then if you were going to go to high school, you kind of went and lived with a relative in town, because there weren't school buses and there wasn't the travel to get, you know, 7 miles out in the country. The country schoolhouse you could walk to or take a mule or something like that. But a lot of people lived with relatives in town and boarded in town to go to high school. So not everybody would be able to. I don't know the situation in part of Texas where Sousa lived, but I'm sure she was, you know, like women of that time, regardless of education. I mean, they knew if they were chemists, they were, you know, they could do everything.
Yeah, you know, it's a tough life. And education was not something that was prized for women in a lot of areas. You know, you were meant to be at home supporting the family. Mm-hmm. That's just the way the time was. So, well, here we have Jean Odom, who's saying 1927 for a printed flour sack. So maybe there's a difference between feed sacks and flour sacks, but yeah, we should probably differentiate those. You're right. I don't know
if Lindsay McCrae is on today, but she's has been a frequent curator of exhibits at the Iowa Quilt Museum, and her book on feed sacks is fantastic.
It is. I have it on the shelf behind me. Yeah. I should look it up. Yeah. I will find out.
So this photo is of Sousa there on the right, and Lehman, which is the youngest, or the firstborn son, and that's Maple. And if I kind of tried to figure out the dates, and Maple would be about age 30 in this picture. And let me find my copy here. And Lehman would have been 47. He's in uniform, so it's in the 40s. And then I think Sousa's around 70 years old in this picture. But I like Maple's dress with the embroidered flowered pockets, or fancy pockets.
It's very fancy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Didn't Lehman say he and Preston met up overseas very shortly before?
It was not Lehman. I looked at that too. If we look back at the quilt and you look at the second row, bottom block, you have Leland. It's Lelan, but that is Leland. So he was born in 1911, and that the man in the picture is Lehman, which is up there a little bit to the left. And so according to the information that your volunteer Susan Macy hunted down, is that Leland was able to visit Preston at the front just days before Preston died, which is sort of amazing. You think of, you know, how unusual that is. And as you said, then after Sousa's death, you know, as remains were continued to be found in Europe, his dog tags and remains were found. And I think there was one, I think Maple, who was his next older sibling, was still alive and did attend that ceremony.
Yeah, the last of the family that's living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the picture that's up right now on Lehman's block there, you can see the imprint of this bead sack label on that one really clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So, this, I'm hoping everyone's enjoying looking at this, because, it's just, it is very crudely made and it's stained and but, I'm not looking at the comments so much, but I mean, there's a charm about it. And, I was talking to you ahead of time, you gals, that the names grab me so much. And they have really interesting middle names. Like I said, Riller is Riller Cassandra. Yeah, that's a chart somebody figured out with all the blocks. So we have Lehman B, who's the first. He's a son. Then Riller Cassandra, Carol, that's a boy, and then Codal Hamby is a boy. So Hamby, and then we have Cleo Myrtle, Fount Leiloni, Leland Tate, Troy Edward, Maple Vereen, and then Preston. So they are
really unusual names.
Yeah.
You just wonder is there a family name? I mean, who knows where they came from, but so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see questions too. Do we think the sashing fabric sashing fabric is hand dyed? I don't know. I couldn't.
It is kind of that strange tan that comes when a dye is really fugitive and it leaves that tan behind. So it's possible, but it's also possible that was just the color. And she, like we said, she used what she had. And so I think even on that sashing fabric, you do see some of the shadows of prints from feed sacks. So, but it could have been a dyed feed sack. I think it's quite possible that it was dyed at one point. Yeah. And hand dyeing especially can be very fugitive. So that would make sense.
Yeah. And the quilting, I mean, we call it utility quilting, which is just a nice way of saying, it's really big.
Yeah.
But I kind of have I'm a longtime AQSG member, and I am a writer, and one of my bucket list things, I don't know if I'll get to it because I'm writing fiction these days, but would be to write a scholarly article on this quilt and dig further. And I kind of when I did all the looking into it years ago, life kind of got in the way, and I moved on to other projects, and I lost contact with Tommy, but we could probably find him again. So anyway, certainly.
We have a wonderful group of volunteers that we call our GTF, our Genealogical Task Force. And Susan Macy is one of those members, and she's the one who researched this quilt. And even when a quilt comes in with a fair amount of information, we try to track down all the primary documents and keep them on file. And our GTF is truly amazing. They have researched over 600 quilts in our collection now. So whether it's in what we call an inscription like this, and this is inscribed in applique, or whether we even have just a single maker, we always try to learn what we can about the quilts. And this quilt is really unusual, but also one of, I'd say maybe 10 or 15 quilts where we'd actually contacted the family members. Mm-hmm. And of course, like you said, Tommy was just so happy to discover that the quilt was here, and he knew it would stay here. So he knew where the quilt was based. But a lot of times we will call people and they do not even know that they have a quilt in the family. Yeah. And then they come to visit, and that is always just the most amazing visit, because it's so meaningful to those people that their family left something behind like that. It's so important to them.
I see a great question here. Tara's put up, how are the letters attached to the base? It's hand, this is raw edge, raw edge, hand applique, blanket stitch. And, a lot of the fabrics are solids, but they're prints. I mean, look at that born there. I mean, that just looks like a little girl's dress to me. So I'm imagining these are scraps from other sewing, hand out, cut out, and then there's no fusible web under there. no stabilizer. It's just, they're just put down. That block you can see is, when I see stains on the quilt, I think, oh, somebody put the baby, changed the baby on the bed.
Yes. Well, what I love about it is that it is obviously not someone who's expert with a needle. I mean, we can, even in the slide, we can see the large stitches, and I just feel like that, you know, we can, as makers, I think, get so caught up in trying to make everything look perfect, look hidden, look the best. And that's really not always what we should. I think it's just more that expression or that enjoyment that we should take away from these pieces.
You know, that's it brings me to mind that this is really a great time to give a nod to Quilt Folk magazine, because this whole idea of these chats kind of came about because we were trying to think of some great program ideas, and I had written an article about this quilt for Quilt Folk magazine's family issue. Mary asked me to write something, and I was tickled to do that. And there was, you know, it was I think it's just a one-page, a shorty in Quilt Folk, and it's like, oh, there's so much more to say about this quilt. So that's kind of why it's due to Quilt Folk that we're looking at it today. And I was mentioning earlier, you know, the kids stop with Preston there. That's the last kid, and then, you know, then Sousa put in when the spouses were born, you know, and then the grandchildren were born. And so, you know, I've certainly answered the question that hit me when I saw this. It was like, who are these people? You know, who are they? Well, they're the people that, you know, in 1927 or excuse me, in 1925, after Papa died, that those were the people in her life. So Linda Niemeyer is saying, what year, well, how old would she have been when she was working on it? Well, okay, that's a great question, because, okay, somebody do this for me. Papa died in 1925. She made it after he died, of course.
I think Wayne Sue is the last date on it, because she was born in 1928. So that is what we've used as a circa date. And when we use a circa denote it that way, that means it's probably a few years on either side of that date. So, but you now was
it was finished twice.
Finished? Yeah, finished twice. Yes.
Some of us are really working hard to finish a quilt just one time. so those were added. So you know, and it I don't know, it's hard to tell. Yeah, Jean is saying it's the equivalent of a family Bible, which is kind of what was my premise was, you know, some people write in the family Bible. That was not enough for Sousa Harris. She put her family story in cloth. And so, you know, I don't know whether the quilt, it looks, how do I say this? It's hard to tell whether it's been used because it kind of looked like it was used when it was made, because it was made of used fabrics and, you know, very humble, ordinary, homely fabrics that were around. And I guess, you know, I just keep thinking and looking at this and thinking of all the beautiful quilts that inspire me to make my own quilts. I've got one in progress right now, but I don't know, this is so human. I think that's what it is. It's such a human quilt, and the stamp of the maker, because it's not perfect. You know, I think I'm just thinking as we're talking, you know, when you see one of those perfect quilts, like the Stearns and Foster, some of those quilts, and some of the French quilts and the Baltimore quilts and competition quilts, and, you know, they almost look like they were not touched by human hands because it's so perfect. This quilt was touched by human hands. It was made by hard-working hands. Yeah, let's look back let's find the picture. Let's see. You can't see the picture with Maple and Lehman. You cannot see. Sousa's hands are behind her back, which is maybe saying something right now. Her hands may have been pretty rough, and she may have put them behind her back on purpose. And I'm looking at the picture. I can't see her hands in the picture with the sisters either, but I imagine they were very, her hands showed evidence of a great deal of hard work.
I imagine so, yeah. That is very interesting that they're behind her back in that photo. Yeah.
See, we have Deborah asking, were these blocks all made at once over the years as a family change? Well, my guess is that Sousa started the quilt after her husband died and worked on it when she had time, and, you know, maybe steadily, we don't know. But, you know, that's just speculation of one quilter of another, but she worked on the blocks. And, you know, I what's popping in my head is a comment that I think Jonathan Holstein made about, you know, the predominance of the block style quilt in America, and how, you know, a block is portable, unlike a medallion quilt. And so you can kind of imagine Sousa, you know, working on these blocks when she had time, not doing other work. And so once the blocks were all done, and she organized them in chronological-esque order, top to bottom, left to right, and then added those other blocks. And you can kind of imagine, as these grandchildren come along, well, gee, they're not in the quilt. You know, it's like she didn't want to leave them out.
Yeah, I love that she added those extra names in there.
But Tina's asking if there's some fabrics in more than one block. I haven't really looked at that. There's a lot of solid red.
I don't think we have really, and I bet that would at least give us another kind of clue to figure out if the quilt was made at one time or things were added later. Though that's always, you know, as in the progression of making a block, sometimes you run out of one fabric and you pick up another. So, but it would be interesting to look at it in that aspect.
I don't get the sense that she cared that much about the fabric she used. That's pure speculation. I mean, she made the name, she had to have enough to make all the letters in a name the same. And I'm looking at the Riller block, and there's the little pink check used for Riller's name looks like the same pink check used in the block further up, the Mama Born block. That's the second one. Looks like the same or a similar little pink check.
Yeah, it sure does. Well, and I think that, like you said, the fact that she's laid it out and Papa's death is the last block, I feel like you said, like she had that plan kind of in place, and she knew how many blocks she needed for the basics set of that quilt, and then went back and added those grandchildren's names.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see a comment from Roxy. I remember my granny's hands very well. They were both big like a man's and rough looking for sure. Yeah. You know, another thing, when you think about farm people, and of course we don't know, there was this just age gap between Papa and Mama, but you know, it's fascinating to me to think back to the fact that family farms really were a small family business, you know, and in the best case scenario, and I'm thinking of the wonderful Grace Snyder, you know, on the farm in Nebraska, and how, you know, it was a partnership between the farmer and the farmer's wife. And yes, the farmer was the head of the household, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, I like to think about this partnership and the division of labor, and the men, you know, did the outside stuff, you know, and women did the inside stuff, and how I think there have got to be plenty of farm families for whom it was a very much shared project, and that the husband and wife, you know, you can see them after the kids are in bed, you know, talking over the planting and talking over the health of the farm and keeping the books and everything. And that was a very big part of our history.
Yeah. Well, and I remember because when I was young, we would stay summers on my grandparents' farm, and they had a pump outside. We had to pump the water, and we had to heat it on the stove. And so when my grandmother we'd start dishes, that water would be boiling hot, and she could put her hands in that and not even really feel it because she'd done it so often. And you know, she handled all the gardening. I remember doing the laundry with her and sending it through the roller on the machine. And again, just her hands were always warm from all that.
That work. Yeah. Bettina's asking when Sousa died, and I have that she died at age 85, but I'd have to do some math well, Bettina could do the math, because because Mama was born in 1876 and she died at age 85. But she is a mathematician, by the way, so.
Yeah. And Joan is asking if we know why Cleo died at a young age, and we do not have that information on her death. I think she's about 8 years old, which is pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's right. That's the only, we have the birth block of birth and death blocks for Papa and the birth and death blocks for Cleo.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information in this quilt.
And I guess that's all of that, just, you know, when you read those names and you read those death dates, you know how heartbreaking that is. And you know that's life being lived. And I think that's what, you know, when you go into our storage room with, you know, 8,000 quilts and all that information, you get this, at least when I'm in there by myself and have a quiet moment, you feel that weight of all these lives lived as they were stitching their quilts. And even when talking to contemporary makers, they go back and they're like, if they haven't seen a quilt in a while, they'll say, I know exactly where I was in my life and what was happening when I was working through that quilt. And so they have such a personal feel like that.
That's the therapeutic value of making. So Deanna is saying something interesting. She teaches a farm lit class, which I'm fascinated to know what farm lit. I can kind of imagine. You know, we'd go to Faulkner again in Yakima, Petafa County. She said, I'd love to use this quote when we discuss material culture. So, you know, talk to Carolyn about.
Get in touch, Deanna. We definitely would be able to share that with you. So
we still have adequate. Let's see, President. Oh yeah, rural electrification. Yep. That's fantastic. Well, when you think about the sewing machine, you know, as the first thing you could buy on the installment plan, and, you know, every woman had one, and she got that ASAP. And then, of course, you see lots of quilts where the blocks are made by hand, but then the long seams are sewn on the machine. Practical. Well, I wanted to be sure and share, is there a back view that has any history? I don't know of a back view.
I believe it's just bead sack back, so nothing in particular.
It's all real loosely woven stuff. But anyway, so funny thing about this quilt. So when I got all excited about this quilt and found that it had been published actually in a couple places with a lot of wrong information about it, and I learned that the dealer Laura Fisher had been the person, like I mentioned earlier, that bought it from John Sauls. And after John Sauls brought it to a Texas Quilt Day and a search day, and that's how some of the wrong information got reported. But anyway, I was going to New York because my oldest kid lives in New York. I was going to New York and I didn't know Laura Fisher, but I contacted her and I visited her in this fascinating kind of storage area. I can't remember what part of Manhattan it was, where she had all these like cribs of quilts, you know, like these, like almost like a stable, like where horses would be, but not that.
I've been there.
So she had sold the quilt to the study center. And so I was visiting, and this was crowded. It was like we're like sitting on bar stools with quilts all around. And she said that at the time that she had the quilt in her possession, she had a young intern working with her. And this young woman was also found this quilt fascinating. She loved the names on the quilt, and she just thought they were just, you know, the bomb. And that she then was making plans to leave New York and go out to California and start a fashion line. And she was going to call the fashion line Riller and Fount. And so there is Riller and Fount. The website is there. It didn't look like anything very active is happening right now, I'm sure because of the pandemic. But, you know, I just love a person that says they're going to do something and then just does it. I know. There we have Riller Cassandra and Fount Liloni, their names there, and looks like American typewriter font, and these cool clothes from 2018.
I love that. Yeah. You know, I think it's just fun because for somebody she was a young woman, and for her to get fascinated with this quilt was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Use it that way is great.
Here's another neat comment. I can't read the year very well. If Cleo died in 1918, but it's actually 1914. She was wondering about the Spanish flu timeline. So you know, we all hear the year 1918 for the Spanish flu. Was it just for 1 year?
I think it was 2 or 3 years really that it was flaring. So yeah, started in 1918. Yeah. Yeah, but there's another, I mean, they lived through that evidently, most of them.
Yeah. There's a great comment. I studied a Quaker quilt where one of the men who was named on it said, "I've buried 3 wives and all my children just before his 4th marriage." So yeah, you wonder, you know, it's pretty easy to say, yeah, well, the father was a hard man. Well, maybe he had a reason, you know, maybe he had suffered losses like that and didn't want to say much about anything to anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we have any information about him being married prior to marrying Susan, but you'd never know.
Yeah.
So, and I think that was just, it just wasn't the same kind of consideration. I think when you were marrying, you needed a young woman who was going to be able, like you said, help on the farm, be a partner in all those things, and give you children.
Yeah.
So.
And, you know, it's funny, we've been talking about all the unusual names, and which is the, you know, the interesting names that grab me and also grab the woman that started the fashion line. But Sousa's name is Sousa Missouri Hale, and she married Tom Harris. So that's a great name too. So how did she get named Missouri, you know?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't think we have any military records. Somebody just asked if the family served in World War I, but it's possible that they did. But I don't think that we have any military records of the World War I.
You know, this is kind
would
of
have been right on the cusp there. Oh, there you are.
Oh, yeah, that's when that was you know, when Tara read your bio about the What's in a Name book. That this quilt was in that exhibit, What's in a Name, and I got to see it in person, which was really fun. I was looking back at the comment about President Johnson. This is a digression, but I like to listen to podcasts when I'm sewing and I'm working on a quilt. And so I ran across this, I think it's called Hidden in Plain Sight, which is also the name of a quilt book. But Lady Bird Johnson kept an audio diary during their years in the White House. And this journalist ran across him in the presidential library, and like nobody had listened to these tapes. And so it's fascinating. If you want to hunt down that podcast, Lady Bird was not, you know, you think of her as wanting to plant a tree and a bush and a shrub, but she was quite interesting. So, and President Johnson relied on her a great deal. He suffered from depression, and she was his rock.
Wow. Well, that sounds really fascinating. I love listening to podcasts while I'm sewing.
Yes.
It's fascinating. There's so many great ones out there. Yeah.
So,
Marianne, what else you had? Any comments? You said some of the family members on the quilt had lived interesting lives. Did you have information on the children and what they did in their lives?
You know, I don't. And at one point I had run across the grandson and talked to him, but I don't really, I don't really know. But I
think it's hard to track that down. When you get into
but
past
Tommy,
1940.
Yeah, Tommy, the grandson, Susan's grandson, Tommy, the one that chewed coffee. You know, he was like a pipeline engineer in Madagascar, and he, you know, would work a long time and then be off for like a month. And his wife, they would meet in Paris, or they would go somewhere in Europe for this long vacation. He sounded like a fascinating person. And I sort of think I got to meet him one time. I have it's ringing a very, very vague, distant bell, or else we talked on the phone. But I just got busy with other things, and you know, that's the way it goes.
You know, it's always interesting. We like to take a chance to go back and relook at all of the information on our quilts about every 5 years, because so much has been added to the resources online that you can look at. So it's always fun to go back and see if there's something new we can find. Oftentimes what we find though is that we can locate a quilt in the right place, the right time. We can find those names, but we can't often figure out why a quilt was made. And I think that's what's so great about this quilt is it tells us what's important to Sousa in this quilt. You know, her family, her children, her grandchildren.
Yeah. It tells us why it was made.
It tells us why it was made.
It's crystal clear. It is crystal clear. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is a fabulous piece. So Marianne, you have been working on a quilt. Well, first of all, someone had asked about the quilt behind you very early on. Can you talk about this beautiful pineapple log cabin?
Oh my gosh. Well, you know, I'm not, if you got, we put my website up and you can visit my website. It's not much, it's a pretty website, but I'm not selling anything. It's just a place where I post things once in a while. And you can find the story if you go to my website and you look for the post called My Long Not Lost Love. This is a quilt that is like one of the most fantastic quilts I've ever seen in my life. It's a wool windmill blade pineapple. Windmill blade log cabin. And I fell in love with it when I was a new quilter. It was made by the ancestors of a local Montrose pharmacy. Anyway, I mean, it's like, this whole story is on, if you can find that blog post, but when the matriarch died a few years ago, the family put it up for auction. And I bought it. and I mean, it's just, the workmanship is incredible. It's wools and print fabrics, and then the border is velvet checkerboard, and it's just like, the workmanship is just amazing. It's amazing, and I don't have to sneak it out of a building because I have it already. And I'm really not a collector.
Sneak that in, Marianne.
Yeah, I'm not a collector. So anyway, it's beautiful. And then the other quilt that's behind my desk, and the quilt on the other side, I'll turn around and show, is another wool antique called Wagon Wheel. And I bought that one in New York City at a thrift shop for like a couple $100 when I was visiting my daughter Hannah. But there's quite a bit of light in my office, and I like having these wool quilts. And when I was setting this office up, because we just moved in October, you know, I thought, gosh, I'm not putting the quilts I made on the wall. I'm like, no, I'm putting the 19th century quilts that inspired me to quilt, you know. Yeah. And both of these quilts have such nuances that if I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the Wagon Wheel, my eyes never tire of looking at it. And if I'm on the sofa looking at this quilt, there's always something to look at. Your eye just goes around and around because it's so, they're just,
yeah, you see something new every day. I love that. Yeah.
So I maybe have 5 antique quilts total. So.
Well, you have spectacular ones. So.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. I feel so fortunate to have it. And I thought, I mean, it's kind of, you know, harking back to Sousa's quilt that her son sold to an antique quilt picker. You know, I couldn't believe that the family would sell this quilt when they know the provenance of it, and it's their ancestors that made it. But families are complicated, and, you know, sometimes it's easier just to divide the money.
It is. It's tough. It is interesting, though, how so many inscribed quilts have survived. And I think it's because they have those names on them that makes them so special that you don't want to use them. You don't want to wash them. So they become kind of the heirlooms and the things that people pass down from one member to another.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, words on quilts, you know, have always grabbed me, not so much signatures, but, you know, actual messages. And I'll have to say, like, last time I really went anywhere out in the quilt world was QuiltCon last year in February. And I mean, what the modern quilters are doing with messaging on quilts is amazing. I mean, there was a whole exhibit of that. I mean, they're just using quilts to make statements of all kinds. Yeah. Really neat. Writing on a quilt. So
it is really neat. So Marianne, we had another kind of fun connection because you are working on a particular quilt. inspired by one in our collection.
Yeah.
And when you told me about that, I said, oh my gosh, this quilt just got hung in an exhibition that's not quite open yet.
Yeah.
But here it is hanging in our West Gallery.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, and it's so funny this came up when we were talking, getting ready for today, is that, so many of my quilts are inspired by older quilts. And I love looking at photographs of older quilts, because you can look at it and see what's magic, what works, what makes this quilt so great. How can I pull that magic out? And so here's a quilt I'm working on. And so I pieced the blocks with the crosses in there, and then I'm hand appliquing the circle. I use a pie plate, make my circle, hand appliquing it. But my husband, Mark, thinks every quilt I ever make is perfect. And we think I love naming them. So I said, it's X's and O's, like hugs and kisses. And so that's why I'm calling this is Hugs and Kisses. And so anyway, and then my Mary was here, and when I was working on it, she said, "Oh yeah, that's in the Holstein exhibit. That's going to be the first quilt when you walk in." So
this is what you see coming down the hall, and this is our 50th anniversary show of abstract design in American quilts. Jonathan Holstein kept we have 58 of the original 60 that were shown. And this one is actually one that his brother owned for years. So when we were starting to work on this exhibition, Jonathan contacted his brother Philip, and Philip decided he would give us the quilt so that we could get it back into this group where it belonged. The challenge we're having is that to put 58 quilts in our West Gallery, which is our biggest gallery, is still a challenge. So we're doing we have a new head of exhibitions named Camilo Sanchez, who just came from Bogota, Colombia to work here in Lincoln. And like he said, putting this exhibition together is like playing with Tetris, trying to fit all these squares and things together. So we're a little bit behind schedule because of the challenge of getting all these quilts together. But it's a fabulous exhibition, and my colleagues have done additional exhibitions that talk about the impact of this show on the art quilt, on the mainstream contemporary quilter, and even a group of Japanese quilt makers. So exhibits all 4 of the exhibits will open in April, and they'll be up through August. So you have that time when you can come and see all of the shows if you'd like to see that. And you can see Marianne's inspiration here.
Well, I'm going to come over, for so long. We're so close together, 2.5 hours from Winterset, Iowa to Lincoln, Nebraska. And I've come so many times because I can drive over, and, there was a travel ban on, we had an exhibit here in Winterset at the Iowa Quilt Museum of quilts from your community collection. And we couldn't even drive them. I mean, they had to be shipped when we had planned originally to save that money, but we couldn't, you guys couldn't leave the border. And so I've got to come and see this exhibit, and I'm fully vaccinated. So I think I can come soon. And if any of you liked my quilt that I'm working on, inspired by this, this fall, Fons and Porter are going to be honored with an exhibit of quilts made by Liz and by me, and I'll have my quilt finished way before that. And it's for a king size bed, so it's got a lot of blocks. And I think I've never done that where you have the notches out, for the bedposts. I'm gonna try that, Yeah, tricky to bind that inside corner, but I'm sure I can do it.
I think you can do it, Marianne. I have faith in you. But yeah, we're very excited. So in October 15th, I believe, the Fons and Porter exhibit will open, and that is my next project. So tomorrow we finish up abstract design, and then Marianne and I are going to put our heads together and start plotting out what we're going to show in the upcoming exhibit. I'm so excited to.
Well, I'll ask you this since I've got you here. I'm dying to know how many quilts will you want from each of us?
Our single galleries don't fit a lot of quilts, depending on how we show them. We generally fit about 12 to 15 in a gallery. Now, we could put some in a display case, and we could stack them. We can put some on a flat surface or a slant board. So there's a lot of different ways we can add, or we can even show a lot. When we show them on rolls, we only show a certain portion of them. So then we can fit in additional pieces that way too. So
I just want to make sure I have enough because I've given a lot of quilts away, but I got quite a few that I can't part with. And people listening might find this interesting is, one of Liz and my real claim to fame is the Quilter's Complete Guide. The book that we wrote that was published in 1993 stayed in print for a long time. And the International Quilt Museum has in its collection the manuscript, the 13-pound manuscript for that book, all the step outs, and one of the sampler quilts that's featured, and original hardcover copy of the book. And did I ever get it to you yet? I asked Carolyn if she'd like the Bernina sewing machine that was used.
You got it to us, yes.
How did I shipped it? I think I shipped it.
I think so.
So even that Bernina sewing machine that a lot of the step outs were made on, and so I imagine hopefully there'll be an ephemera type, a case with stuff like that, and I think people would get a kick out of it. So when we are able to get names like yours in our archival collection, Marianne, it's so important. So many people from AQSG are supporting the archival collection right now because of Mary Kay Waltvogel's and Barbara Brackman's efforts in creating a scholarship. And that's such a great example of what we always try to do. We try to get the whole picture, the whole story put together again, because just imagine if we had that kind of information about Susan, if we had that depth of information. We're able to learn a lot about her, but there's a lot of makers we can't. And we just don't want people to go back and say, now, why didn't they collect that or think about this? So I was just so glad to get it out of my basement, And by the way, that book was put back in print by Dover Publications. So Quilter's Complete Guide, I imagine, we have it at the Iowa Quilt Museum. You can buy it from our gift shop. They probably have it at the Lincoln gift shop, and you can buy it. Don't buy it from Amazon, please. Buy it from one of the museums. It helps us out. Yeah. So, no, I mean, the royalties, I'm not, just the retail, buy it from the museum. It's called Quilter's Complete Guide. And for many people, it's really the Bible of quilt making. And even though it was written a long time ago, all the techniques and everything, it all still really works. If you need to know, just about anything, you can find it in there.
Look at us, our very first show, and we have the woman who wrote the Bible.
That's a small b, by the way.
No, I think it is so great. And gosh, Marianne, it's time we have to wrap up. But this has been so much fun, and
I can't wait to see what everybody else picks. The other quilts that our fellow AQSG members, what they want.
I have seen a few of them, and I know that they're going to be fabulous. And Marianne, I just want to thank you for you and your contacts at Quilt Folk really made this happen, and it's just been such an honor to be with you today. And once a month now for about the next year, we have at least 8 of the next months for the next year. We're going to be doing these Sunday programs, so I hope people will come back again. And we have a stellar list of
it's been
amazing
fun.
Scholars and people who are so knowledgeable. We're going to learn so much from these fun conversations. So
bye for now.
Look forward to seeing you soon, guys. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Marianne, and thanks,
I'm
Kara,
coming
for all your
later.
help. All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.